Unsure of how to write a grown-up novel herself, Wilder studied the work of a writer she admired, her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane. Like the original Charles and Caroline in Let the Hurricane Roar, for example, Manly and Laura have no surnames in the first 4 years. They are simply an archetypal couple, not pioneers but homesteaders, next generation in the history of settling the West. And like Let the Hurricane Roar, most of the action centers on the wife and her struggles to accept the life her husband envisions for them. I've discussed the parallels between the two books in detail in my biography of Wilder, but let me give you just one quick example. Let's start at the beginning of both books, that moment when first Caroline and then Laura embark on their new lives with their husbands. In Let the Hurricane Roar, Caroline was sad because she was leaving her family forever. She ached for the busy family life with her mother and sisters in the log cabin, for her father coming home from work or hunting, for the oak trees by the door and the path to the spring. But these memories soon ceased to hurt her in her happiness with Charles. Wilder's depiction of Laura's departure with Manly on their wedding day in the first 4 years has a similar feeling in style and tone. As Laura looked back, Ma, Pa, and Carrie and Grace were grouped among the young trees. They threw kisses and waved their hands. Bright green leaves of the cottonwoods waved too in the stronger wind of the afternoon, and there was a little choke in Laura's throat, for they seemed to be saying goodbye, and she saw her Ma brush her hand quickly across her eyes. Manly understood, for he covered Laura's hand with one of his and pressed it strongly. Wilder's passage contains more warmth and intimacy than Lane's, but both exhibit a similar detachment from their characters and create an undercurrent of tension between the two couples. The young wife still longing for the security of home, the new husband drawing his wife into their new life. Despite the striking parallels between the two novels, the first 4 years exhibit several characteristics that define Wilder's work, whether she's writing for young readers or adults. Certainly the warmth of her voice, as we've just seen in the previous passage. Although Wilder is more detached from her characters in the first 4 years, she continues to include small, concrete details that add warmth and tenderness to the novel, as we've just seen Manly taking Laura's hand and pressing it strongly. But the first 4 years also includes these characteristics that emerged in Wilder's work for young readers. There's warmth in Wilder's treatment of her characters, but they remained emotionally restrained with each other. Lane argued with her mother on this point throughout their editorial collaboration on the Little House books, but Wilder stood her ground. We were not excitable, usually. It seems to me we were rather inclined to be fatalistic, to take things as they came. I know we all hated a fuss, as I still do. So Wilder's characters in the first 4 years are restrained. They don't deliver emotional outbursts as Charles does in Let the Hurricane Roar. I'm not a baby, losing sleep won't hurt me. Compare this passage with the one in the first 4 years after Manly suffers a stroke. From that day on, there was a struggle to keep Manly's legs so that he could use them again. Some days they were better, and again they were worse. But gradually they improved until he could go about his usual business if he was careful. A fatalistic and inherently dignified acceptance of tragedy. No melodrama here. Like the rest of the Little House books, the first 4 years demonstrates Wilder's preoccupation with the West. Her descriptions of the prairie are vivid, immediate, and concrete. The landscape becomes a kind of character in her novels. It influences and shapes Wilder's main characters in profound and enduring ways. The same holds true in the first 4 years. Laura loved to watch the wild geese high against the blue of the sky, large V's and smaller V's, with the leader at the point, his followers streaming behind, always in perfect V formation. There was something so wild and free about it, especially at night, when the lonely wild cry sounded through the darkness, calling, calling. It was almost irresistible. Laura longed for wings so that she might follow. And yet, as in Wilder's other books, nature is an ambivalent force in the first 4 years. It is powerful, uncontrollable, and ruthless. And in the first 4 years, it wreaks havoc with Manly's dream to build a successful and profitable farm on the prairie. Toward the end of the novel, the natural world even invades Laura and Manly's home. After that, they all sat in the house and let the wind blow, their ears filled with the roar of it, their eyes and throats smarted with the dust that was settling over the room, even though the doors and windows were tightly closed. Although the central storyline in the first 4 years parallels the one in Let the Hurricane Roar, the central conflict in the book is uniquely Wilder's, one that she had written about before, not in the Little House series, but in an article she'd written years earlier for McCall's magazine in 1919 entitled, "Whom Will You Marry?" In the article, a young woman comes to the article's author seeking advice. Her fiancé is about to return from the battlefield of World War I with plans to be a farmer. The young woman asks, Would you be a farmer's wife if you had the chance to live your life over again? Wilder's answer, of course, is yes. But the affirmation comes after a long monologue with herself. And while the article doesn't disclose what the young woman's decision will be, it's clear from the context of the piece that the older, wiser narrator in the article has influenced the young woman's decision. Wilder clearly felt that being a farm wife was fulfilling. There is a joy of spirit and pride of power that comes to a farm woman who is fully alive to her opportunities, meeting and solving problems, confronting and overcoming difficulties, refusing to become petty, though attending to numberless details, or to be discouraged before threatened disasters. This advice seems almost tailor-made for the Laura of the first 4 years. And of course, when the novel ends, she embraces her life as a farmer's wife and wholeheartedly shares Manly's dream. It's tempting to read the first 4 years as an autobiographical novel, to assume that the real Laura Ingalls Wilder may have struggled with her role as a farm wife during the first years of her marriage. And yet, nothing in Pioneer Girl or the Little House series supports this view. In Pioneer Girl, the Little House series, and even her work for the Missouri Ruralist, Wilder never hinted that she had been unhappy or dissatisfied with her role as a farm wife, or that it had been a source of conflict between herself and her husband. Throughout the Little House series, Wilder embraced, as we've seen, agrarian values and presented the character of Almanzo as a heroic figure because of his association with the land and his dream to farm it. His success as a fearless, shrewd, and successful homesteader gains first Pa's respect and then Laura's. As for the fictional Laura Ingalls herself, throughout the series she enthusiastically milked cows, helped Pa make hay, and sometimes worked in the fields. Look at this passage from Little Town on the Prairie. Afterward, it seemed to Laura that she did nothing but study that whole summer long. Of course, that was not true. She brought water from the well in the mornings. She milked and moved the picket pens and taught the new calf to drink. She worked in the garden and the house, and in haying time, she drove down the great loads of hay that Pa drove away to town. But the long, hot, sticky hours with school books and slate seem to overshadow all else. In this passage, the fictional Laura resents studying, not farming, and the chores that come with it. These happy golden years ends with Laura and Almanzo sitting contentedly on their front doorstep, gazing out at a distinctly 19th century agricultural landscape. Laura's heart felt full of happiness. She knew she'd never be homesick for her old home. It was so near that she could go to it whenever she wished, while she and Almanzo made their new home in their own little house. All was theirs, their own horses, their own cow, their own claim. The many leaves of their little trees rustled softly in the gentle breeze. The fictional Laura Ingalls is happy with her new lot in life. She doesn't bristle against the constraints of being a farm woman. Pioneer Girl paints a similar picture. Nowhere in its pages does the real Laura Ingalls complain about Almanzo's dreams of becoming a farmer, or tell him, as Laura does in the first 4 years, "I don't want to marry a farmer. I have always said I never would. I do wish you would do something else. There are chances in town now while it is so new and growing." As I mentioned earlier, the Laura in the first 4 years is clearly different from the Laura Ingalls of the earlier Little House series. Can you imagine her marrying a merchant like Almanzo's brother Royal, a school teacher like Mr. Owen, or saloon keeper, lawyer, or railroad man who had taken advantage of those chances in town? What I'm getting at here is that when Wilder cast about looking for a central conflict for her first adult novel, she chose to dramatize an idea that had long been close to her heart, the joy of spirit and pride of power that comes from being a farm woman. And she gave this lesson to a new and different Laura in a grown-up novel. Which brings us to 2 final questions about the first 4 years. Is the first 4 years a continuation of the Little House series? And is the first 4 years a successful novel? For me, the answer to both questions rests with what we can infer from Wilder's own response to her original manuscript. She didn't seek publication for the book. It was her secret, a creative experiment that she chose not to share with a wider audience. For Wilder, the Little House series ended with these happy golden years, and her literary reputation, which was always important to her, rested on her work for young readers. Remember what Wilder told Lane back in 1930, just after she'd completed Pioneer Girl? That she was interested in prestige and not money. Wilder had been interested in writing for children since her father's death in 1902. Perhaps she simply recognized that the prestige she longed for as a professional writer would be better served by her books for young readers. Perhaps she recognized her niche as a writer and put the adult story away without regret. But where does that leave the first 4 years, should the book have been published at all? Positioning the manuscript as the final Little House book is perhaps a mistake. In many respects, the first 4 years is a kind of sequel to Let the Hurricane Roar. As adult historical fiction, these 2 novels explore how 2 generations of young, idealistic Americans settled the West. Had the first 4 years been positioned as an adult novel, as Wilder had always intended it to be, the confusion and criticism over that faint air of disillusion would have probably been less, and Wilder's literary reputation may not have been tarnished by critics who have used the book to contend that Wilder was an inferior writer, unworthy of her own literary reputation. Yet, given Wilder's literary standing, Ursula Nordstrom, her editor at Harper's, indeed made the right decision to publish the manuscript. It answered that inevitable question, what happened next? And by not tampering with the manuscript, by letting Wilder's adult voice come through on the page, Ursula Nordstrom also gave readers something new from Wilder, who clearly wasn't afraid of artistic experimentation, even in her 70s. And that's an important lesson for all of us.